This channel is only possible thanks to direct contributions from you, the viewers. Seriously, thank you guys. If you'd like to contribute, you can do so for as little as $1 a month on Patreon, or come pick up a t-shirt at the merch store. Links below. Hey gamers, welcome to the next section of our exploration of the Aspect Zodiac. Before we dive in, let me answer two comments that I thought were particularly relevant to understanding the ideas we're talking about here. The first is by Diego Torres, who expressed concern about the fact that some of my audience almost definitely includes impressionable children and teens, and suggested that it might be a good idea to remind the audience that the aspects and everything else to do with Homestuck is fundamentally fictional, and should be regarded as such. And he's completely right. Look guys, Homestuck draws on a lot of mythological and philosophical imagery, so some of the ideas it uses for world building do seem intuitively convincing to some people. This is stuff that spiritual and religious movements have been built around before after all. But that doesn't mean that Homestuck is literally real, and it's important to keep that in mind because I really do think some people take this stuff a little far, even psyching themselves out and stressing over whether they're really the aspect they were assigned, or what their chosen or given aspect says about them. And I just don't really think that's a healthy way to engage with this stuff. The aspect system is supposed to be fun. The class system is supposed to be fun. I think this stuff is worth thinking about, but only because it can be really fun and sometimes illuminating of the different angles and perspectives that go into telling or reading a story. It's cool if thinking about these symbols eventually leads you to some sort of introspection about yourself that you find meaningful, but that's not necessarily what they're for, and it's important not to conflate or overpower your sense of identity with an imaginary power set system from a webcomic. I guess I wouldn't fault anyone who wanted to find spiritual identification with parts of Homestuck, in the sense that people are entitled to whatever they believe within reason, but I personally relate to Arrghus' quote on the story of the Sufferers religious movement when it comes to my own relationship to Homestuck. I prefer to see myself as a fan of the story and what it represents. Hope that's a reasonable answer. Our second comment comes from Safu Regardpa, who asks, what the hell does that which can only be known to everyone mean? And yeah, the most crucial sentence in Andrew's explanation sure is a weird cryptic word salad, right? Let me try and explain what I think it means as far as I can tell. A thing that might be known to anyone is the idea of a dog. If I say the word dog, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and we can reasonably expect that almost everyone else can too. You might even be able to narrow the abstract category of dog down somewhat by mentioning subtypes like terrier or dachshund, but there's a limit to how specific we can get about them. For example, if you've had a long-standing relationship with a particular dog, you'll probably find it basically impossible to try and communicate to anybody else all of the minute differences and shared experiences that separate your special pup from any other iteration of his breed or even his species. It would also be basically impossible to try and recreate that exact dog through something like alchemy, even if it might be quite possible to create a reasonable genetic copy of the dog. That's because your dog would be defined by existing in actual reality, and having a history and context in that reality that includes shared experiences with you, that a duplicate simply wouldn't have. That's the conceptual limit that I think Andrew is referring to. The imaginary world is vast and filled with recognizable patterns and images that almost anyone can be trained to recognize, including even really complex ones like stories and movies. But it can never fully capture all the nuances, unique connections, and experiences of any one of our individual lives. It can never perfectly convey the reality of how we perceive everyone around us, who is each unto themselves an infinite void of possibility defined mostly by how it changes over time, just like us. That might have been just as arcane and impenetrably bullshit as Andrew's answer though. Sorry if it was, but I gave it my best shot. Now let's get to the video. Last time we discussed the division between the imaginary/notional aspects and the material/real aspects. Another duality, one arguably even more well established in the Homestuck universe, is that of passive and active. It's well established that classes can be sorted into passive and active, but the classes are not the only thing in Homestuck divided along these lines. The moons of Prospect and Durst drive their respective dreamers to behavior falling in line with the active and passive principles as well. And at the same time, the moons themselves seem to have a peculiar affinity for certain players. Specifically, every single hero of space in Homestuck is identified as a Prospect dreamer, and indeed they've all spent quite a bit of time there. Even Porum, who we barely see any of, carries a memory of a particular Prospedian railway as the solution to a minor puzzle, directly connecting her to the place. By contrast, every hero of time dreams on Durst, often in an almost uncontrollable manner, as with Dave being awake without knowing it, or Aradia's dream self resting within Durst's core and, if certain theories are to be believed, using her powers to manifest the spirit of her dead waking self into the world of the living. Side note, with the advent of the Troll Call and Friendsem, we've been introduced to trolls who buck this trend, such as Tagora, Malik, and Skyla. Actually, only one Troll Call troll follows it, Rumali. What this means for the Aspect Zodiac going forward is unknown. So if the passive-active dichotomy is bound to Prospect and Durst are bound to the aspects of space and time, does it then follow that space and time themselves, and perhaps all the aspects, are connected to the passive-active dichotomy? The most passive class of all, the Muse, is held by a spacebound, Calliope, and the most active class, Lord, is held by a time-bound. So then what does passive and active mean when referring to the aspects? As far as we can tell, it refers to scope, broad or narrow, multitudinous or singular. The left side of the wheel, filled with cool and distant colors, is the domain of the passive principle, filled with aspects more closely connected to the notion of paradox space as a broad and complex world, filled with interconnecting and intersecting patterns. At its center is found the aspect of space, with its clinical white-on-black galaxy pattern, the aspect of endless breadth and a creative potential that oftentimes seems more a duty than a calling. Where bearers of passive classes are prone to putting the needs and desires of their friends before their own, bearers of passive aspects are prone to perceiving reality in a broad sense, zooming out to look at a bigger, more objective view of things. The right side of the wheel, filled with hot and fiery colors, is the domain of the active principle, filled with aspects more closely connected to the notion of paradox space as a world which exists only in the individual's perception. At its center is found time, the aspect of individual destiny, mortality, and ultimately the challenge to choose one's path for oneself. Where bearers of active classes are prone to putting their own needs and desires before those of others, bearers of active aspects are prone to perceiving reality in a narrow sense, zooming in to look at a more particular, subjective view of things. This juxtaposition might also be described in terms of temperature in a cultural sense. Socially speaking, the idea of being cool typically implies being reactive and attentive to the world around you, knowing enough to perceive where you are and where you stand relative to everything else, but also a kind of level-headed disattachment. And of course, being a cool guy implies being unfazed and unchallenged by the things around you, having an unflappable, level-headed stoicism to whatever's going on that comes across as just plain old not giving a shit, just being too cool and in control of yourself to really care too much about what's happening around you. Whereas being hot-tempered implies being passionate and emotional in your decision-making, focusing on your feelings and thoughts really intensely, and following those feelings and thoughts to dramatic, intense results. If you ask me, coolness much more readily describes Terezi, Jade, and Roxy, who tend to be a lot more stoic and unfazed by stuff, than it does, say, the Striders. Which I guess has you asking, are we implying that Jade, Terezi, and Calliope are all better cool kids than Dave and Dirk? Yes. Absolutely. Which is the note we'll be leaving out on for now. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our introduction to the Aspect Zodiac system, and that you stay tuned next time for our talks on the fixed and mutable aspects. For the record, I have no idea if those two are each gonna get their own video, or if this little aspect series just surprised us all by doubling its own length. Guess we'll find out together. Until then, keep rising. Huge thanks go out to my patrons for making this video possible. If you want to help support the channel and come join us at our awesome and growing Discord community, feel free to join us for as little as $1 a month. You can also find me on the r/Hiveswap Reddit and Discord. That's all for now, so thank you again, and as always, keep rising.